We are reaching the end of college football, and that makes me sad, but we do have another week of games to review, and that's what I want to do today. We are going to be examining some of the big games of the weekend, starting with Coastal Carolina, a minus 13 favorite at Troy. The line for this total is 51.5. They had a big win last week against BYU. Of course, we were all over that. Not toot, but toot. This is a letdown spot, right? I would say yes, if you were playing against a formidable opponent, and I just don't think that Troy is that opponent. They did lose to BYU 48-7. They lost to Appalachian State 47-10. So the question becomes, are their strengths good enough to contend in this spot? Looking at the Troy offense, they don't run the ball. They're 118th in rushing yards and averaging just 3.2 yards per rush. They are a one-dimensional offense. They are 26th in passing yards, averaging 280, and they aren't really efficient at doing that. They're 76th in yards per pass, averaging 6.9. Against BYU, they had just 4.5 yards per pass versus Appalachian State. They averaged 5.7 yards per pass, but they produced just 10 points, and they were shut out in the second half with just 73 yards of total offense in that second half. Then you got to look at the Coastal Carolina defense. BYU averaged 333 passing yards and 10.6 yards per pass, and they were held to 240 and 7.5. Against a better passing offense than Troy in Arkansas State, they gave up 350 passing yards and 7.9 yards per pass, but they still held them to just 10 points. Troy has utilized two quarterbacks. They've been sacked a combined 21 times, and now they're going up against the Coastal Carolina defense that has produced 34 sacks, 12 interceptions, and 13 forced fumbles. Not to mention that Coastal Carolina is top 15 in that run game. Of course, we know what Grayson McCall can do with his arm, but this team is still a run-first team. Troy gave up 275 rushing yards and 7.2 yards per rush to Appalachian State. You cannot be one-dimensional and not that great at being one-dimensional with no pass rush, a vulnerable offensive line, a vulnerable defense, and expect to be competitive. This line has dropped from 13.5 to 13 and is now juiced to Troy. And I would say that it's because people are thinking Coastal Carolina is going to let their foot off the gas going into their championship game next week. But here's what I say. Grayson McCall had the point spread as an underdog in his locker room right before game time. I think this is a team that knows what the spread is, and they are a team that wants to cover that spread. Why else could this line be dropping? Because folks see that Troy just had a 29-0 blowout win on South Alabama last week. But if you look at South Alabama, they are 83rd in total offense. They are 90th in total defense. They have a bottom 10 offensive line and just average 19 points per game. So I'm not impressed. There's still a shot, an outside shot, that the Chanticleers make a New Year's 6 game. So give me Coastal Carolina minus 13. In what is perhaps the biggest game of the weekend, we have Navy at Army, a 7-point home favorite. The total for this game is 38.5. This line did open at Army minus 5.5 and the total of 39, and of course has dropped some, rightfully so. The under has hit 14 straight years, but keep in mind, this is also the lowest that the total has been set. Last year's total was 42, and in 4 of the last 10, the total was in the 50s. Can you imagine? Also in the last 10, Army is 3-7 straight up. They're 6-4 against the spread, and of course, 0-10 to the under. What's interesting about this game is that Army has not played in the last 2 weeks, and Navy is coming off its 4th straight loss to what I will say has been a really tough slate of competition. They lost 37-21 to Houston, 51-37 to SMU, 10-7 to Memphis, and 19-6 to Tulsa. Navy is super hard to handicap because they played 3 rushing teams in BYU, Tulane, and got wrecked in weeks 1 through 3. But of course, the Navy coach did explain that they had 0 contact practice before the season, and it definitely showed. Then their next 4 opponents were all pass first teams, ranked bottom quarter in rushing yards per game, and then they had 3 weeks off from COVID issues, and then they limited both Memphis and Tulsa to under 300 yards of offense and just 19 points combined, 4.4 and 4.8 yards per play. Looking at their offense, though, they were only able to produce 320 yards of offense to Memphis, but just 7 points and 2.4 yards per rush and 150 yards of offense to Tulsa and 6 points. Looking at Army, they're 7-2 on the season, but 4 of their wins came against Louisiana Monroe, who is 0-10 straight up, 119th in total offense, and 114th in total defense. And then 3 wins against FCS opponents, one of which they almost lost outright. Then they did lose 24-10 against Cincinnati, which is perhaps their biggest opponent and their biggest performance, holding them to 2 yards per rush off 35 attempts and 69 total rushing yards, but they got trucked 38-12 by Tulane and had a narrow 28-27 win over Georgia Southern. In that game, they had just 1 pass attempt, produced just 3.3 yards per rush, had 3 turnovers that resulted in 14 points for Georgia Southern, and pulled out the win against Georgia Southern because they spiked the ball too late within field goal range to come out with the win. I'm going to stick with Army here, though, because I do think that they have the better offense, and Navy has crossed the opponent's 45-yard line just 4 times in 2 games. I'm going to look at Army -7 at home. Now for a game that I am looking most forward to watching is North Carolina at Miami, who is playing 3-point home favorite. The total in this game is 66.5. What is the first thing that I look at when looking at a game? It is going to be the pass rush for either side. Can your defense apply pressure to your quarterback, and is an opponent able to take the blow? So then let's look at the pass rush. Both of them have really solid pass rushes, and both of them have really terrible offensive lines. Looking at the North Carolina defense, they have produced 31 sacks for 200 yards lost, 7 interceptions, and 7 forced fumbles. D'Eriq King, he has been sacked 24 times for 150 yards lost. He has 4 interceptions, but he also has just 44% completion when under pressure, 55% when adjusted. Then you've got the Miami defense. They have produced 28 sacks also for 200 yards lost, same 7 interceptions, but 11 forced fumbles. Hal has been sacked 28 times for 170 yards lost. He has 6 interceptions, but the big difference is that he has 8 touchdowns to 2 interceptions when under pressure, specifically 54% completion and 68% adjusted. So he's definitely the better quarterback who can handle the blows. So then if I'm going to look at the quarterbacks, then let's compare the quarterbacks. Howell is the better pocket passer. He has 3,100 yards, 10.5 yards per pass, 26 touchdowns. Keene is definitely more of a runner. He has 64% completion, but just 8.2 yards per pass because he has nearly 500 yards on the ground for an additional 4 scores. So then if I'm looking at the quarterbacks, then let's look at the defenses. We know that North Carolina's passing defense is just awful. They are ranked 105th in the country for passing yards allowed, giving up 260 yards per game, 7.6 yards per pass. What you may not know is that Miami's passing defense is also pretty bad. Though they are ranked 60th in the country for defending the pass, besides Clemson, they have faced just 2 passing teams in the top 50. They faced Pitt, who was without their starting quarterback, and then when they faced NC State, they allowed 280 passing yards, but 9.6 yards per pass and 41 total points. Aside from Clemson, North Carolina will absolutely be the best offense that Miami has seen. North Carolina has 8 wide receivers with at least 200 receiving yards, 2 stars in De'Ami Brown and Daz Newman, 1,600 yards combined, 13 touchdowns, and 15 yards per reception. I do think that North Carolina has more playmaking ability. Sam Howell, he doesn't need to run the ball because he has 2 running backs to handle the load for him who have 1,800 rushing yards combined for 23 total touchdowns. D'Eriq King is the second leading rusher on his team, so if you can contain him, then you can contain this offense. I am looking at North Carolina +3 and sprinkling some on that money line +135 and give me the over 66.5. 2 trash defenses, really great offenses. Give me points. Next, we've got LSU at Florida, who is playing a 23-point home favorite. The total for this game is 67. Florida is 0-2-1 against the spread in the last 3 with 3 straight unders, but I do think this is an opportunity for the Florida offense to shine. Neither of these teams run the ball. They are both 113 and 102 in rushing yards, but they are also top 20 in the passing game. Florida is first, averaging 376 passing yards per game, and to no one's surprise, they are highly efficient. They are ranked 8th best, averaging 10 yards per pass, sandwiched right in between 2 of my favorite MAC teams in Kent State and Buffalo. I just had to throw that in there. And LSU is 19th, averaging 306 passing yards per game, not as efficient, throwing 7.3 yards per pass, but and here is the caveat, those passing stats for LSU are definitely misleading because Miles Brennan did have 3 games under his belt before injury where his team was able to produce 3 straight games of 34, 41, and 41 points. So when you look at the stats for just TJ Finley, he is averaging 188 yards per game and 6.7 average. He may not get the start as head coach Ed Ogeron has yet to announce a starter, so it could be either Finley or Max Johnson. Johnson does have 63 attempts. He's 64% completion, 2 touchdowns. So I do think that against this defense, he could be the better option. But this LSU team is definitely not the same offense without Brennan. One thing that has stayed constant is their lack of defense. LSU is bottom 3 in defending the pass, allowing 313 passing yards per game, 9.7 yards per pass, and 33 points per game. Remember that opening game against Mississippi State where we were fooled thinking that the Bulldogs was some type of stud of a team? That is because LSU allowed 632 total yards of offense, 10.4 yards per pass, had just 9 rushing yards because they didn't need to run the ball. They put up 44 points and 5 passing touchdowns, even with 2 interceptions thrown from KJ Costello. Since that game, LSU allowed 406 passing yards from Missouri, 11.6 yards per pass, 45 points. They allowed 300 passing yards from Auburn, made Bo Nix look like a stud, throwing 11.5 average, 48 points. Then they allowed 339 yards from Arkansas. I love me some Philippe Franks, and he had himself a day, throwing 13 yards per pass. And then against Alabama, they had just 385 passing yards, but 13.3 average. Mac Jones had 4 touchdowns, 55 points scored. This is a bad defense as you can get, and Florida actually isn't that much better. Florida is 80th, allowing 242 yards per game, 7.4 yards per pass, and 25 points per game. They allowed 443 yards to Ole Miss, 13.4 yards per pass, 35 points. Even against A&M, they allowed 338 passing yards, 9.4 yards per pass, 41 points. Philippe Franks, we just mentioned him having a day against LSU. Well, he had the same day against Florida. He had the same 13.2 yards per pass, 35 points up onto this Florida defense. Their defense looks to be improved, limiting their last 3 opponents to 17, 10, and 19 points. But you have to look at who those teams are, and it was Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Tennessee. These teams are ranked 107th, 116th, and 105 in total offense. They averaged just 14, 21, and 20 points per game, which is what they were able to put up on Florida. Gators, they may not have a defense, but they do have a solid pass rush. They have produced 19 sacks, 6 interceptions, 9 forced fumbles. Finley has been sacked 4 times against Alabama. Johnson, through 63 attempts, he's been sacked 6 times. So either of these quarterbacks, whoever gets to start, I think is going to have a rough day. With Brennan, give me the over, but with Finley or Johnson, I think I'll take LSU to cover the spread instead. LSU's tight end, Arik Gilbert, he has opted out, so that's one less weapon for LSU. That is worth noting because he is LSU's second leading receiver. I do think that they are looking for style points here, anything that's going to kind of guarantee a potential spot into the New Year's Six or into the playoffs. LSU minus 23. Moving over to the Pac-12, we have the USC Trojans at UCLA, who is playing a 3-point home underdog. This is also the final game for these two squads in the shortened 2020 season, so it is a pretty big deal for both teams. In terms of yardage, they are pretty similar. USC is averaging 424 yards per game, 5.7 yards per play. UCLA is right there, keeping up, averaging 430 yards per game and 5.8 yards per play. They're just going about it differently. USC is really good at passing, and UCLA is really good at running. So who wins? So then let's look at UCLA versus the pass. The best ranked passing team that the Bruins have faced was against Oregon, who is ranked 27th. They averaged 128 passing yards per game and 9.6 yards per pass. In that matchup, UCLA gave up 334 passing yards, 11.4 yards per pass, and lost 38-35 because UCLA had 2 turnovers that resulted in 14 points to Oregon. Then you got to look at USC versus the run. The best ranked run team that they faced was against Arizona State, who is ranked 23rd, averaging 211 rushing yards per game and 5.8 yards per rush, though it is Arizona State, who has played just 2 games this season. They do have 2 teams in common. When facing Arizona, USC allowed 444 total yards, 7.9 yards per pass, 4 yards per rush, and 30 points. UCLA defense showed some strength in this game. They allowed just 300 yards, 4.3 yards per pass, and 3.8 yards per rush, and limited them to just 10 points. And then you've got that same team, Arizona State. USC had a narrow 28-27 win, allowing 392 total yards, 5.8 yards per pass, 6.8 yards per rush. It was a very sloppy game. There were 7 total turnovers, 3 lost fumbles from Arizona State, and 3 lost fumbles plus 1 interception from the USC Trojans. UCLA, they definitely played a clean game. They did give up 442 yards, 7.7 yards per pass, and 4.7 yards per rush to come out with the 25-18 win after a safety forcing 2 turnovers. So this is going to come down to turnovers. Who can have a clean game? UCLA defense has 20 sacks this season. They have forced 4 interceptions, 4 forced fumbles, 2 recovered. The USC defense has not been as strong because they do have just 14 sacks to their credit, but they have forced 6 interceptions. What has helped USC is fumble luck. That defense has only forced 2 fumbles, but they have recovered 6. So I think that this is going to be a close game. UCLA nearly defeated Oregon without their starting quarterback. So I like the Bruins to come out with the upset. I'm going to take UCLA +3 and the money line +130. Looking at the final game, we have Virginia at Virginia Tech, who is a 2.5-point favorite. The total for this game is 63. You have 2 very efficient offenses versus 2 very inefficient defenses. Looking at the offenses, both of these teams are averaging 424 to 438 yards per game and 5.4 to 6.4 yards per play. Looking at the Virginia offense first, the Cavaliers are definitely more of a balanced offense. They are 50th in yards per game, averaging 242 passing yards, but they drop to 97th in yards per pass, averaging 6.4, so they're definitely not that efficient on the passing game. They can also run the ball, however. They are 49th on the ground, averaging 182 rushing yards per game and a very efficient 4.7 yards per rush, ranked good for 48th. Looking at the Virginia Tech offense, the Hokies are a bit more one-dimensional. They are definitely a run-first team. They're 91st in passing yards, but the caveat here, the interesting thing, is that they are far more efficient than Virginia, averaging 8.6 yards per pass. It's no surprise, Hendon Hooker, he's definitely a great quarterback. He did get clocked during the Clemson game last week, but it is said that he is fine and definitely expected to play. The ground game is definitely their strength. They are 10th in rushing yards per game, averaging 238, and 7th best in yards per rush, averaging 5.6. These two teams, they aren't just good at accumulating yards, they are putting up points, averaging 29 and 39 points scored per game. Virginia Tech holds the edge in points per play, ranked 33rd over Virginia, who is ranked 71st, and both are top 50 in red zone scores. Their defense, however, is the problem. Neither can stop anything. Looking at the Virginia defense, the stats say that Virginia is 36th in defending the run, but they have played just 2 rushing teams in North Carolina and Louisville. Versus North Carolina, they allowed 536 total yards, did limit North Carolina to 2.8 yards per rush, but gave up 15.8 yards per pass and allowed them to come back from a 41-20 deficit. Ultimately, Virginia did win this game 44-14. And then versus Louisville, they gave up 317 rushing yards, 8.1 yards per rush, but won 31-17 because Louisville did throw an interception into the red zone and then gave up 2 fumbles. Looking at the Virginia Tech defense, the Hokies, they aren't stopping anyone or anything. They are allowing opponents an average of 34 points per game. They are ranked 91st in opponent red zone attempts and 95th in opponent red zone scores. So they are letting teams not only get downfield, but then they are letting them put up some points. Neither of these teams can make the stop on 3rd down, so I think the best bet for this one is to take the over in this game at 63. 2 really great offenses, 2 really suspect defenses. Give me points.